I'm going to talk a bit about regulation and CQC. The first thing to say is that the manifesto isn't really very clear what it means, what it's actually talking about. It talks about new national standards. Because last time I checked, CQC standards were national. You haven't got different standards in Northampton and Cornwall. What you probably do have is different inspectors in Northampton and Cornwall interpreting those standards in different ways. And I do wonder if some of this actually is going to be a theme about how you try and improve the consistency of interpretation rather than necessarily setting national standards around care, because we actually have quite a lot of work in terms of setting national standards around care. What we think is as well is that national standards are likely to extend beyond simply care. And one of the areas that the new government appears to be very interested in is the financial performance of providers in many different ways. So obviously, at the moment, we have market oversight, which makes sure everyone hasn't gone bankrupt and is about to collapse. But it isn't just that interest in whether or not you're about to collapse. I suspect it may also be interested in things like what kind of profits do you make? And Josh was mentioning in Wales, so one of the things that's happening in Wales is that there is a plan to take the profit out of children's homes. So if you're a for-profit children's home provider, it's a bit unclear what that actually means. So if you're in Wales and you're a for-profit children's home provider, what does that actually mean if you're going to take the profit out of children's homes? Because you've probably borrowed money, for example. Is that profit? You've got shareholders. Presumably, their dividends is profit. It is interesting to see what that will look like. I think the other part of what they mean by standards, and again, it relates back to some of the stuff that we were talking about before, is it's also going to be about employment practices. And I think this idea of kind of ethical employment is something that we'll hear quite a lot about. And it's often an area of particular challenge in large, low-paid workforces. So we're talking about this in the context of care, but you can imagine some of these issues arising elsewhere across the kind of workforce. There is a kind of narrative that is an economy based on lots of people not earning very much money and not being very well treated. So I think there is definitely a kind of push around standards around there. There's probably going to be some need to think differently for smaller and larger organisations. It's quite hard to reconcile the idea of a way kind of operational standards or kind of workforce standards or money standards necessarily being exactly the same right across the piece. So I think although we think the kind of market oversight regime is probably the kind of starting point, I think that there may be a different strategy for smaller organisations, and there also may be an expansion of that market oversight group, because in reality, it actually only covers really quite a small portion of the market. So although they are quite big organisations, in terms of how much of the market they actually control, it's not that great. So I think you will see some kind of push around there. There is this appetite to lean into some of the kind of standards they perceive as being within the voluntary sector, the kind of ways that people are treated, the ways that people act as employers, the experience that people have working in that sector. It is important to recognise that's based on their understanding of the voluntary sector, which may not be that sharp and may also be based around much smaller organisations than many of you. When people talked about failure within the market of social care, the idea was that other providers will step in and pick up the pieces. There may be some appetite by some local authorities to be the person that steps in and picks up the pieces. And one of the things that runs through all of this, and I think, again, it's kind of very early doors, is this idea of licensing. Because it is through licensing that they will achieve ultimately control of the social care market. So if you have to be licensed to deliver social care, which I think is where ultimately they would like to end up, and that's one of the things that you see in a national care service, obviously, if you do things that people don't like, you can lose your licence. And if you lose your licence, then you can't run your business. So it is a very powerful sanction, which isn't that difficult to formulate. It's probably difficult to formulate a way, I hasten to add, that you wouldn't find yourself in court fighting it. But I do think it is probably the direction in which these things are likely to go. Having said that, expanding and deepening regulation of health and social care has not gone stormingly well so far. And I think it's fair to say that there is quite a struggle at the moment to make those things kind of work properly. The other thing that really stands out for me is this hole in their thinking about self-funders. Most of you in the audience here are not providers of older person services, but the vast majority of older persons provision in this country is self-funded. It's not, in fact, funded by the state. The state plays a part for some people, contributes a portion of the cost for another group of people, but the vast majority of people are paying for their own care. And it's very unclear in the kind of thinking that's going around that is where those people sit and where those people would sit in terms of national standards. In the example I've got here is, if you send your children to a private school, that private school doesn't have to follow the national curriculum. It still has to pass Ofsted, but it doesn't have to follow the national curriculum. it's hard to imagine that you could impose some of this regime on people if they took no money from the state. And the only way you could is through a licensing agreement, if that makes sense. So traditionally, we use funding as the means of control, but if you're not actually getting any funding, if you're not getting your money from local government or whatever, then actually you don't have to do what you have to do. And it's very interesting. I was at a conference the other day, which was largely the private sector. It has to be said, largely the private sector, largely older people's services. Very angry. Woof, what an angry group of people. Very, very angry. Particularly with CQC, it has to be said. Not so bothered with local government, but really, really cross with CQC. But they weren't that bothered about local government because local government is not as important to them as CQC are. That's part of the reason why they're not. Whereas when we talk about things here, ultimately very cross about local authorities, slightly less cross about CQC. This reverse is true in the private sector. I think Labour will have to work out quite quickly what their position is in relation to those people and what their position is in relation to terms of support. I mean, obviously, one of the underlying ideas of a national care service is that ultimately the local authority will do the commissioning for everybody. But you still can't compel people to go to the local authority. Now, if it was a good service, people would choose it. You know, if you thought, actually, if I go to my local authority and say, would you help me buy a residential care home for my mother? And you thought you were going to get a tip-top service and it was all going to be great, you might do that because you don't know what else to do. But actually, if all you heard were horror stories about they keep on losing the files and they don't know what they're going to do, you'd say, oh, well, I'll just do it myself then. And therefore, you're kind of outside of the system that they're trying to establish. So I think in terms of that sort of regulatory approach, there is a kind of real struggle about how do you fit it all together? How do you get it all kind of lined up? And then the other part about it is who's going to do all of this? So in theory, it could be CQC, but probably not the CQC that we have today. Obviously, the CQC we have today is in some difficulties. Lost its chief executive at very short notice. The upside, from our point of view as social care organisations, is that we've now got two people who are former directors of social services, one at the top of the organisation and also the chief inspector for social care is also a former director of social services. Interestingly, both county councils, just by the by, Oxfordshire and Norfolk rather. But what you do have is at the moment, at the top of CQC, is actually people who do know quite a lot about social care. I don't think it's been planned that way. I think it just happens to, that's how it's happened to have arrived at that place. Obviously, we talked a little bit about financial oversight. The other thing is about the skills of CQC to regulate different sorts of things. And what we've seen is that's not always there. So the example I got there is the digital piece. There really isn't really much capacity within the CQC to regulate the kind of digital aspects of social care. And that's only going to go in one way. It's only going to get bigger and bigger and more complex. And just saying to people, oh, you know, do you keep your records safe? Yes, we do. Yes, yeah, we do. Very safe. Isn't going to cut it. You need to be able to check it in some way, in the same way that you can check other things. And also within CQC, there isn't that much engagement with digital either. We've only just started the assurance program in terms of local authorities, and we can already see that it's really quite light touch. And that probably isn't really good enough in terms of how you do those things. It also doesn't recognise the difference and scale of and role of providers, both private and not-for-profit. And then lastly on this bit, obviously they were meant to be also moving on to the regulation of ICBs, but their original plan was rejected. That wasn't seen as going to do the job. And that was obviously the old minister who rejected it. So one of the things for the new minister, for Wes, is to decide how does he want to regulate that thing? How does he want to regulate ICBs? What should that look like as a programme? I can understand why they got a kind of knockback on it. Because if you look at all the things they have to regulate, ICBs are probably the single most difficult one. It's a huge entity, vast amounts of resources, really, really complicated. And you'd need huge teams of people to go and have a look at it and understand how it works. To think about all the people you have to talk to try and be able to form a view about its effectiveness. But it is also something that doesn't sort of inspire confidence in terms of thinking about the idea of standards and regulation. There are some discussions about you could split it off in different sorts of ways. If you didn't want CQC to do it all, you could think about splitting it by size. So you could say that the kind of financial oversight piece is going to, for big organisations, is going to stay with CQC. For smaller organisations, something that local authorities could do. I don't know how many people have ever sent a copy of accounts to a local authority on their request and then found they couldn't read them, or they misinterpreted the information that's being sent to them. Doesn't actually fill me with a huge amount of confidence. There is also talk that maybe the Department of Health itself takes a bigger role in some of that regulation. That actually maybe it has potential to have a regulatory function in terms of looking at the sector. I would have thought there might be some appetite for that under this government. And the bit that's most likely to shift, I would have thought, is some of the kind of market oversight stuff. That's the bit that's most likely to be plucked out of CQC. And then the last thing is that there is also this idea that maybe we need to have a different sort of regulation altogether. Maybe something that looks a bit more like the regulation of social housing. So what you're talking about there, and again, it would be dependent upon a licensing regime, but if you imagine you had to get a license to operate as a large provider of social care, you would have to talk about your financial performance, you'd have to talk about your governance, you'd have to talk about the quality of the services that you were doing. That may still stick with CQC, but you might have to explain yourselves and all of that sort of... And also, of course, the other feature about the housing regulator is powers to intervene. Now, the only way you could acquire those powers, as far as I can see, is through a licensing regime. Because the threat would be, well, actually, you don't have to do as we say, but we'll just take your license away. But you can keep your license if you put somebody else on your board, for example. So it's those sorts of issues that I think we might need to... I don't think it's imminent. I don't think it's what we're going to think about next week, but I think the way that this argument shapes up, there's still, I think, time to influence it, but people do need to start thinking about some of these kind of issues as they kind of get along with it. 15 years. I looked it up. I had to look it up. 15 years since CQC was established under the last Labour government. How time flies. Never actually achieved consistency in terms, I've said standards, that's slightly unfair, but I suppose never achieved consistency in terms of enforcement of standards. But it is clear to us, I think, that if they want to move forward with this, they will probably have to do something with CQC. I would be quite nervous if I worked for CQC, because I think change is coming. I think they will want to reshape it to fit whatever vision they actually end up with. And some of that may be kind of losing power. I don't think there's not going to be a regulator of health and social care, but I think it may be a different sort of regulator going forward. I just wanted to also touch on DILNOT in terms of regulation. And we've kind of alluded to it. I have to go back and look at slides from many years ago to remind myself, how do you actually implement a cap on care? So a couple of things I would say. First of all, I think we're more likely to see a cap on care than we are a change to income thresholds of means testing. And that's because the cap on care doesn't necessarily cost you very much money, if anything, really. It's kind of touch and go whether it costs you very much money. But some of the things to remind ourselves with that was, if you're a local authority and you were going to do it, first of all, local authorities were very much in the driving seat of the cap on care. And so local authorities would have the power to determine, well, that's definitely care, but that's probably not care, so that doesn't count towards the cost of the cap. And then the other thing was this issue about different sort of tariffs, that just because your care costs a certain amount of money, actually the local authority doesn't have to accept that. So you could say, I'm going to go to this service which costs like £300,000 a year and I'm going to hit my cap almost straight away. Well, that's not how it works. They can determine what the tariff should be. So you may be paying £3,000 a week. They're saying, actually, of that £3,000, only £1,000 is going to count towards the cost of your care cap, because that's what we were paying elsewhere in the system. All of which, I have to say, were pretty much designed to enable local authorities to control the speed at which people actually reach the cap on the cost of care and the point at which they would have to pick up the tab. So that's how it was before. All of that would need some sort of regulation, and all of that would need to be compliant with the law. The reason that we're a bit suspicious about the October 25 deadline is, as far as I can see, there's none of this happening. None of this is going on. So maybe if people have got it already, can dust it off, and you wrote it a few years ago, I can see it, see if I can make it work. What do we think next? I think the first thing that's going to come down the road is this idea of consultation. And it is going to be, I think, mainly about workforce, but it's going to be about workforce in the broadest sense. And a lot of that will impact on all the other things that follow on from it. And I suppose the thing to think about is that I know many of you are members of various trade bodies and all the rest of it, but I think it is well worth this sort of feeding into this process as much as possible. New governments like to think they're very consultative. They like to hear the voices of the people that they think they're going to regulate. They'll be less interested in you at the end of 5 years. But right now, at the beginning of this, they're going to be much more interested in what you've got to say. And I suppose, to be fair, under previous Labour administrations, there has been perhaps quite more appetite for that kind of discussion and hearing what people think about things. So I think it is a really good opportunity to do those sorts of things. But again, and I stress this, in many ways, the future of social care is really about waiting to fix as much of the NHS as they can, which then frees them up to think about social care. I don't see a huge amount of thinking and acting going on in relation to social care before then.